The mausoleum door won't seal. My hands are slick with rust and something worse, something wet and wrong. The vandals are coming, their shadows stretching like claws across the gravestones. I've got a flashlight and a wrench. But the real horror isn't them. It's the scratching inside the crypt. Grandma's voice hisses through the stone. "Sarah, I'm still here, and I'm not alone." The lock clicks. The door moves. On its own. Sarah Miller gripped the heavy iron skeleton key until the serrated teeth bit into her palm. The sun was a bruised purple smear against the Virginia horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the Miller family cemetery. It was 94 degrees, but the humidity felt like a wet wool blanket draped over her face, thick with the cloying, sweet rot of funeral lilies. Her fingers, usually steady enough to draft the most delicate architectural blueprints, trembled as she guided the rusted key toward the mausoleum's lock. 1, 2, 3, she whispered under her breath, a rhythmic mantra to steady her racing heart. She needed the numbers. Numbers didn't lie. They didn't shift underfoot. Behind her, the sounds of bickering rose like heat waves from the scorched earth. "It's not just about the liquid assets, Robert." Kevin's voice cut through the stagnant air, sharp and impatient. He adjusted his gold Rolex, tapping the glass 3 times. Tap, tap, tap. "The real estate holdings in Arlington alone are worth more than the entire trust. We need to liquidate before the market dips." Robert Miller stood like a statue, carved from the same gray granite as the tombs. Concrete dust was etched into the deep creases of his palms, a permanent mark of his trade. He didn't look at his son. Instead, his eyes darted upward, counting the invisible grid of the sky, as if searching for a structural flaw in the heavens. "The estate stays whole," Robert rumbled, his voice a low vibration that Sarah felt in the soles of her boots. "Mother's will was clear. We don't break the foundation. You start pulling bricks from the bottom, the whole house comes down on your head." Sarah ignored them, focusing on the resistance in the lock. The iron tumblers were jammed with decades of grit and salt air. She leaned her weight into the door, the cold stone pressing against her shoulder. The mausoleum was a masterpiece of 19th century masonry, but the ironwork was failing. She could smell the metallic tang of oxidation. It felt personal. If she couldn't fix this lock, she couldn't seal the door. And if the door wasn't sealed, the geometry of the space was broken. 4, 5, 6, she hummed. The key turned with a screeching groan that sounded like a bone snapping. The heavy door groaned open an inch, exhaling a draft of air so cold it turned the humid sweat on Sarah's neck to ice. The argument behind her died instantly. The silence that followed was heavier than the heat. For a moment, even the crickets in the tall grass stopped their rhythmic chirping. Sarah froze, her hand still on the iron handle. The air coming from the dark interior didn't smell like a tomb. It didn't smell of dust or dry bone. It smelled of wet peat and something sharp, like a copper penny on the tongue. "Did you hear that?" Kevin asked, his voice losing its executive edge. He flipped his silver coin, the metal flashing in the dying light. He caught it, but didn't look down at the result. "Hear what?" Robert snapped. Though his eyes remained fixed on the ceiling of the porch nearby, Sarah didn't answer. She was looking into the darkness of the crypt. The shadows there seemed thicker than they should be, pooling on the floor like spilled ink. She reached for her heavy metal flashlight, the weight of the aircraft-grade aluminum comforting in her grip. She clicked it on, and the beam cut through the gloom, reflecting off the polished marble of Eleanor's fresh sarcophagus. The lock was fixed. The door was open. But as Sarah stared into the void, she realized the math of the room was wrong. The interior dimensions didn't match the exterior footprint. There was a gap, a hollow space behind the stone that shouldn't exist. The piece of the cemetery was shattered not by a ghost, but by the crunch of gravel. Sarah spun around, the flashlight beam sweeping across the rows of headstones. 3 figures emerged from the thickening dusk. They wore heavy hoodies despite the sweltering Virginia heat. The leader, a young man with a jagged scar through his eyebrow, stepped forward. Justin Scott. Sarah recognized him from the local news. A petty vandal with a reputation for urban exploration that usually involved a crowbar and a spray can. Beside him, a smaller boy, Brandon, shifted nervously, the sound of crinkling sugar packets in his pockets echoing in the quiet. "Lost your way, boys?" Robert said, his voice dropping an octave. He didn't move, but his posture went rigid, a predator sensing a threat to his territory. Justin didn't answer with words. He cracked his knuckles, pop, 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 in a deliberate, rhythmic sequence. "Heard the Millers were burying more than just Grandma today," he said, his eyes unblinking. "Heard there's jewelry in there that hasn't seen the sun in 80 years. Now get off this property." Kevin stepped forward, trying to summon the authority of a man who ran boardrooms. "I have the sheriff on speed dial." Justin laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "Phone lines are down all the way to the county line, Suit. Storm's coming. Nobody's coming to help the rich folks tonight." He lunged. The violence was sudden and messy. Justin swung a heavy iron pipe, the metal whistling through the air. Robert moved with surprising speed for a man of his bulk, catching Justin's wrist and shoving him back toward a headstone. But the other 2 vandals were already closing in. Sarah didn't scream. She didn't have time for it. As Brandon rushed her, she swung her heavy drafting bag, the metal scales and architectural tools inside acting like a flail. The bag connected with the side of Brandon's head with a dull thud. He stumbled, sugar packets spilling across the grass like white blood. 7, 8, 9. Sarah counted, her mind compartmentalizing the chaos into a series of tactical movements. She saw a second attacker swinging a crowbar at Kevin. Her brother ducked, his expensive silk suit tearing as he rolled through the dirt. Sarah lunged forward, her heavy flashlight raised high. She slammed the butt of the light into the attacker's shoulder. The man cried out, the sound of the blow echoing off the stone walls of the mausoleum. The fight was a blur of heavy breathing, the smell of damp earth, and the metallic tang of blood. Robert was a wall of muscle, throwing punches with clinical detachment, while Sarah used her flashlight like a baton, striking at joints and pressure points. She wasn't fighting like a victim. She was fighting like a woman who knew exactly how much force it took to break a structural support. Justin snarled, swinging the pipe again, but the Miller's desperation was a stronger fuel than his greed. With a final, coordinated push, Robert shoved Justin back toward the gate. Sarah swung her bag one last time, catching the third vandal in the ribs. "Get out!" Robert roared, his voice shaking the very ground. The vandals retreated, stumbling back into the trees, their silhouettes swallowed by the encroaching storm. Justin paused at the edge of the woods, his eyes glowing with an unnatural intensity in the flash of a distant lightning bolt. He spat on the ground and disappeared. Sarah leaned against the cold granite of the mausoleum, her lungs burning. Her heart hammered against her ribs. 1, 2, 3. She looked down at the mud-slicked grass. Something glinted near her boot. She reached down, her fingers brushing against a cold, hard object. It wasn't a coin or a piece of jewelry. It was a brass key, heavy and intricate, with a bow shaped like a coiled serpent. It was far too ornate for a common thief to carry. She held it up to the fading light. The teeth of the key were clean, unrusted, and familiar. "This doesn't belong to them," Sarah whispered. She knew this pattern. She had spent hours studying the architectural flourishes of the Miller mansion. This key didn't fit any door in the cemetery. It belonged to the private study in the house, the one room Eleanor had kept locked for 40 years. "Sarah," Kevin panted, wiping mud from his forehead. "You okay?" She didn't answer. She stepped back toward the mausoleum, her ear drawn toward the stone. The wind was picking up, a low moan through the trees. But beneath it, there was another sound. A rhythmic, wet scratching. Sarah pressed her cheek against the granite. The stone was vibrating. It wasn't the wind. It was coming from inside. "Eleanor?" she breathed. A voice, thin as a spider's silk and colder than the storm, drifted through the pores of the rock. It wasn't a plea for help. It was a warning. "The lock is the body, Sarah," the voice whispered, the words rattling like dry leaves. "The blood is the bolt. Do not let the shadow see your heartbeat. I am holding the door, but the hinges are tired." Sarah recoiled, her boots skidding in the mud. The mausoleum stood silent, a gray monolith against the blackening sky. But as the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, Sarah knew the geometry of her world had just collapsed. The dead weren't resting. They were working. The drive back to the mansion was a silent gauntlet of rain and shadows. The storm had broken with a vengeance, the sky opening up to drench the Virginia hills in a deluge that turned the roads into rivers of red clay. Inside the SUV, the only sound was the rhythmic slap of the windshield wipers. 1, 2, 1, 2. Sarah clutched the brass serpent key in her pocket, the metal growing warm against her leg. She could still feel the vibration of the mausoleum wall against her ear. "The blood is the bolt." The phrase looped in her mind, a nonsensical equation she couldn't solve. The Miller estate loomed out of the downpour like a rotting crown. It was a sprawling Victorian monstrosity, all gables and dark wood, perched on a rise that overlooked the valley. As they pulled into the gravel circle, the house felt different. Usually, it was just a building, a complex arrangement of joists and load-bearing walls. Tonight, it looked like a mouth. "I'm calling the police," Kevin said as they stepped into the foyer. The air inside was stagnant, smelling of lavender and damp wool. He reached for the landline on the mahogany side table, but he didn't even get to dial. He stared at the receiver, then tapped the hook 3 times. Dead. The lines are totally dead. "The storm took the trees down," Robert said, his voice flat. He headed toward the cellar door, his eyes fixed on the ceiling tiles. "I need to check the sump pump. If the foundation floods, we're in trouble." Sarah didn't follow him. She headed for the stairs. 1, 2, 3, she whispered, counting the risers. On the 13th step, her foot landed on air. She stumbled, her heart leaping into her throat. She looked down. There were only 12 steps on the blueprint. She knew it by heart. But tonight, there were 13. She reached the landing and hurried toward Eleanor's study. The door was heavy oak, the grain of the wood twisted into knots that looked like screaming faces. She pulled the brass key from her pocket. It slid into the lock with a sickeningly smooth click, as if the house had been waiting for it. The room inside was frozen in time. A layer of dust lay over everything like gray snow. Sarah moved to the massive Victorian desk in the center of the room. Her flashlight beam danced over stacks of yellowed papers and old ledgers. She began to search, her fingers flying over the mahogany surfaces, feeling for a seam, a hidden catch. She found it near the bottom of the right-hand drawer, a small recessed button hidden behind a flourish of carved ivy. She pressed it. A hidden compartment clicked open with a puff of cedar-scented air. Inside were 3 leather-bound ledgers. Sarah opened the first one. Her eyes scanned the elegant, copperplate handwriting. It wasn't a record of grain prices or cattle sales. It was a list of names. 1,892. Silas Thorne, laborer, foundation deposit. 1,893. Mary Lowe, laundress, hearthstone anchor. Next to each name was a dollar amount, followed by a description of a ritual of containment. Sarah's breath hitched. These weren't employees. They were sacrifices. The Miller fortune hadn't been built on industry. It had been built on the literal bodies of the poor, used as spiritual anchors, to bind something the family had dug up in the hills a century ago. The temperature in the room plummeted. Sarah saw her breath puff out in a white cloud. "The math," she whispered, her eyes wide. "The house isn't built on stone. It's built on debts." A sudden, violent thud echoed from the foyer below. It sounded like a sledgehammer hitting a hollow log. "Sarah, get down here." Kevin's scream was raw with terror. She grabbed the ledgers and ran. As she reached the landing, she saw them. The heavy oak front doors weren't just closed, they were bolting themselves. She watched as the iron deadbolts slid home of their own accord, the metal screeching as if being pushed by invisible hands. "What's happening?" Kevin was backed against the wall, his silver coins spinning wildly on the floorboards. Robert stood in the center of the hall, staring up at the family portraits that lined the gallery. Sarah followed his gaze. The oil paintings of their ancestors were changing. Thick, black fluid, like old engine oil, was seeping from the eyes of the portraits, trailing down the canvas and dripping onto the floor with a rhythmic splat, splat, splat asterisk. The smell of rotting lilies, once a faint background note, became an overwhelming stench that burned the back of Sarah's throat. "The seal is breaking," Robert whispered, his eyes tracking the black oil as it pooled on the expensive rugs. "Eleanor is gone. The debt is calling for payment." A massive crash shattered the silence. The stained glass window in the dining room exploded inward, shards of colored glass flying like shrapnel. Through the jagged opening stepped a figure that made Sarah's blood turn to slush. It was Justin Scott, the vandal leader. But he wasn't human anymore. His skin was the color of a bruise, and his eyes were entirely black, leaking the same oily fluid as the portraits. He carried a heavy sledgehammer, the head of the tool dripping with dark mud. He didn't speak. He just cracked his knuckles, a sound like dry branches snapping in a winter wind. "Run," Sarah urged, grabbing Kevin's arm. "To the service corridors. The walls are thicker there." They scrambled through the kitchen, the sound of the sledgehammer smashing through the mahogany furniture behind them. Sarah's mind was a frantic grid of the house's blueprints. She knew the secret passages the servants had used 100 years ago, spaces between the walls that didn't exist on the official tax maps. They ducked into a narrow pantry, Sarah pulling a hidden lever behind a shelf of canned peaches. A section of the wall swung inward. They tumbled into the dark, narrow space just as the pantry door was ripped from its hinges. The darkness in the service corridor was absolute, smelling of dry rot and ancient dust. Sarah turned on her flashlight, the beam catching the terrified faces of her brother and father. "We have to get to the cellar," Robert panted, his hand gripping his chest. "The main anchor is there. If we can reinforce it." "Reinforce it with what, Dad?" Sarah snapped, her voice trembling. "More bodies? I saw the ledgers." Robert didn't answer. He just looked at the ceiling, counting the floorboards above their heads. The sound of the sledgehammer began again, a slow, rhythmic pounding on the other side of the lath and plaster walls. Thump, thump, thump. The entity was tracking them, sensing their heartbeats through the wood. "He's coming through the wall," Kevin whimpered. Sarah looked up. They were standing beneath the main support beam for the grand staircase. She saw the stress fractures in the wood, the way the house was groaning under the weight of the supernatural pressure. "Kevin, give me your belt," she commanded. "What?" "Give it to me. And Dad, I need your pocket knife." She worked with the frantic precision of an engineer under fire. She used the leather belt and the knife to create a tension trigger on a loose structural support. It was a gamble, a calculation based on the failing integrity of the house. "When I say run, you run toward the back exit," she whispered. The wall beside them exploded. Justin's possessed form stepped through the dust, the sledgehammer raised high. He looked at Sarah, a terrifying, empty grin stretching across his face. "Now!" Sarah yelled. As they bolted down the narrow corridor, Sarah kicked the trigger. The support beam, already strained to its limit, gave way with a deafening crack. Tons of plaster, timber, and masonry cascaded down, burying the possessed vandal in a mountain of debris. A cloud of white dust filled the air. Sarah didn't wait to see if he was dead. She knew the entity wasn't that easy to kill. They reached the back door, but as Kevin grabbed the handle, he froze. He turned back to Sarah, his face pale in the flashlight's beam. But he wasn't looking for an exit. He was looking at the ledgers in her hand. Slowly, Kevin reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, sleek pistol. He pointed it at Sarah's chest. "I can't let you take those out of the house, Sarah," he said, his voice suddenly calm, devoid of the panic from moments ago. "Kevin, what are you doing?" Sarah's heart stopped. "The ledgers," Kevin said, tapping his watch 3 times. "They aren't just evidence of a crime. They're a map of the energy this family controls. I've been talking to some people, a firm in London. They don't care about the ghosts. They care about the yield. This estate is worth billions if we can harvest what's under the ground." Robert looked at his son as if seeing a monster for the first time. "You'd sell your own blood, Kevin?" "I'm a miller, Dad." Kevin sneered. "I'm just doing what the founders did. I'm making a deal." The house groaned again, a deep, subterranean sound that vibrated through their marrow. The earthquake tremor hit a second later, throwing them all to the floor. The ground beneath the Miller estate didn't just shake, it screamed. Sarah felt the vibration travel from the soles of her feet to the base of her skull, a low-frequency hum that turned her vision into a blur of gray and black. The earthquake wasn't a natural shift of tectonic plates. It was the sound of a seal finally snapping. Outside, the storm reached a fever pitch. A bolt of lightning struck the lightning rod atop the mansion, sending a cascade of sparks raining down past the windows. In the sudden strobe light flash, Sarah saw the cemetery through the back door's glass. The earth was yawning open. A jagged fissure had split the graveyard in 2, swallowing headstones and ancient oaks alike. The mausoleum, the stone anchor of their family's dark history, was tilting at a precarious angle. "The seal," Robert gasped, clutching a doorframe as the floor buckled. "It's gone. Eleanor's body." It wasn't enough. Kevin scrambled to his feet, the pistol still clutched in his hand, though his aim was shaky. "Doesn't matter. The deal still stands. I just need those books." Another tremor, more violent than the last, sent a chandelier crashing down in the nearby parlor. The sound of crystal shattering was like 1,000 tiny bells ringing at once. Sarah saw her chance. As Kevin stumbled, she lunged forward, her shoulder catching him in the gut. They tumbled into the mud of the backyard, the rain instantly soaking them to the bone. Sarah scrambled away, the leather-bound ledgers tucked tightly under her arm. She didn't head for the road. The road was a river of sludge. She headed for the cemetery. "Sarah, stop!" Kevin roared, his voice nearly drowned out by the wind. She didn't stop. She counted the paces. 10, 20, 30. She knew the geometry of the graveyard. She knew where the weak point was. The ledgers hadn't just listed the sacrifices. They had described the countermeasure. The signet of the father, the blood of the son, the will of the daughter. She reached the edge of the fissure. The air rising from the crack in the earth smelled of ozone and ancient, stagnant water. The darkness inside the hole seemed to be moving, a liquid shadow that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic heartbeat. "The ring!" Sarah yelled, turning back to see Robert stumbling toward her through the rain. "Dad, the signet ring. I need it." Robert reached her, his face a mask of grim determination. He looked at the abyss, then at the ring on his finger, a heavy gold band with the Miller crest. "It won't work, Sarah. You can't fix a foundation built on rot." "I'm not fixing it," she screamed over the roar of the storm. "I'm resetting the lock." Suddenly, the sound of a heavy engine cut through the wind. Sarah looked up. A massive cement truck was lumbering through the cemetery gates, its tires churning the mud into a frothy red soup. Behind the wheel sat a man with a wild, haunted look in his eyes. The truck lurched to a halt near the mausoleum. The driver's side door opened, and Robert stepped out. Sarah froze. She looked at the man beside her, then at the man stepping out of the truck. The man beside her faded like a mist, his form dissolving into the rain. It had been a projection, a trick of the flickering light and her own desperation. The real Robert Miller stood by the truck, a shotgun cradled in his arms. He didn't look like a father. He looked like a contractor about to finish a job. "I'm sorry, Sarah," Robert shouted, his voice booming with a terrifying clarity. "But some things need to stay buried, all the way, deep enough that the sun never finds them again." He raised the shotgun. "Dad, no." Sarah dived behind a tilted headstone just as the gun barked. The lead pellets chewed into the marble, spraying her with stone dust. "I'm saving you," Robert yelled, his voice cracking. "If I bury the crypt, if I fill the hole with 10 tons of reinforced concrete, it can't come out. The secret dies with us. It's a spiritual tide, Dad. You can't stop it with Max Slab." Subverted beat. Sarah watched as Robert pulled the lever on the side of the truck. The massive mixing drum began to rotate with a heavy, grinding groan. Clunk, whir, clunk, whir. A thick gray slurry of wet concrete began to pour down the chute, aimed directly at the yawning mouth of the abyss. Sarah felt a surge of hope. It was a logical, brutal solution. If the physical opening was sealed with enough weight, perhaps the pressure would hold the darkness back. Concrete was Robert's life. He knew the math of load-bearing better than anyone. 10 tons of quick-set mix would create a plug that not even a ghost could move. Sarah crouched lower, watching the gray sludge fill the crack. Maybe he was right. Maybe the physical world could win this fight through sheer, stubborn mass. Robert's face relaxed. He lowered the shotgun, a small, triumphant smile breaking through his exhaustion. The concrete was flowing steadily, a river of stone swallowing the shadows. The rhythmic grinding of the truck was the only sound now, a comforting, industrial heartbeat. The earthquake tremors seemed to settle. The black smoke rising from the pit began to thin, trapped beneath the rising tide of gray. "See?" Robert shouted, his shoulders dropping for the first time in years. "Wait, Sarah. Weight keeps things down. We just had to be heavy enough." Sarah stood up, her hand over her heart. She felt a wave of relief wash over her. The math made sense. Pressure versus resistance. They were winning. But then she noticed a detail that was wrong. The concrete wasn't pooling. It was flowing into the pit, but the level wasn't rising. It was as if the abyss was drinking it. Sarah frowned, stepping closer to the edge. She looked at the surface of the wet cement. It wasn't smooth. It was beginning to ripple. Small, perfectly circular bubbles were rising to the surface, popping with a sound like a wet gasp. "Dad," she whispered, "why isn't it filling up?" Robert stepped toward the chute, his brow furrowed. "It's a deep hole, Sarah. Just give it a minute." But the ripples were growing larger. Suddenly, the concrete began to change color. The dull gray was being shot through with veins of oily black. The entire 10-ton mass of wet stone began to vibrate. Not with the truck's engine, but with a frantic internal rhythm. The reveal hit like a physical blow. The darkness wasn't being suppressed. It was using the concrete as a conduit. A massive pillar of black-veined stone erupted from the pit, the concrete hardening instantly into a jagged, obsidian-like spike. It didn't seal the hole, it acted as a bridge. The seal hadn't just failed. Robert had provided the entity with the physical matter it needed to manifest in the world. The truck was suddenly yanked forward, its massive tires leaves the ground as the bridge pulled it into the abyss. Robert screamed, diving out of the way, as the multi-ton vehicle was swallowed by the earth like a toy. The darkness wasn't a spirit anymore. It was a physical tide, a slurry of wet stone and ancient malice that began to pour out of the pit, flowing across the grass toward the town. Robert's smart solution had given the monster bones. "What have I done?" Robert wailed, staring at his empty hands. The mausoleum doors, the last line of defense, buckled outward with a sound like a thunderclap. The stone didn't just crack, it disintegrated. And from the center of the ruin, Sarah heard it, Eleanor's final death rattle, a long, wet sound that ended in a name. Sarah. The void was open, and Sarah was standing right in front of it. The world turned into a kaleidoscope of gray mud and black oil. Sarah was thrown backward as the ground beneath her vanished. She felt a crushing weight on her legs. A fallen marble pillar from the mausoleum's portico had pinned her to the earth. She gasped for air, but the atmosphere was thick with the scent of ozone and scorched dust. The black tide was inches away, a slow-moving carpet of shadow that withered the grass as it touched it. 1, 2, 3, she wheezed, her ribs screaming. She reached for her bag, her fingers brushing against the cold gold of the signet ring she'd managed to snatch from the mud during the chaos. She looked at the keystone of the fallen archway, just inches from her face. It was the heart of the structure, the piece that held the geometry of the seal together. She didn't try to push the stone. She didn't try to run. She pulled the heavy drafting compass from her bag and, with a strength born of pure terror, began to etch. She didn't draw pictures. She etched numbers, the precise architectural coordinates of the binding ritual she'd found in the ledgers. She used the signet ring as a guide, pressing the family seal into the soft limestone of the keystone. The angle of the debt, she hissed through gritted teeth. The square of the sin. As she finished the final digit, she slammed the signet ring into the center of the etching. The effect was instantaneous. The keystone didn't just hold, it pulsed with a blinding white light. The structural collapse she'd triggered wasn't just physical. It was a spiritual vacuum. The black tide stopped mid-flow, then began to rush backward, sucked into the vortex created by the reset seal. The earth groaned one last time, a deep, satisfied sound of a lock clicking home. The fissures slammed shut with a force that rattled Sarah's teeth. Silence fell over the cemetery. The storm broke, the clouds parting to reveal a pale, cold moon. Sarah lay in the mud, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked to her left. Kevin was curled in a fetal ball, his silk suit ruined, his eyes vacant. To her right, Robert sat among the ruins of his truck, staring at his hands as if they belonged to a stranger. They were alive. The debt was paid. For now. Subverted beat. 3 days later, the sun rose over the Miller estate, but the light felt thin and artificial. Sarah stood in the grand foyer of the mansion. The black oil had been scrubbed away, but the scent of lilies remained, a permanent ghost in the woodwork. She held the ancestral ledgers in her hands. These books were the source of the rot, the records of every life stolen to build this house. Kevin had begged her to keep them, his greed already recovering from the trauma. Robert had asked her to hide them. No more, Sarah whispered. She walked to the massive stone hearth in the drawing room. She crumpled the yellowed pages of the first ledger and tossed them into the embers. She watched as the flames took hold, the paper curling and blackening. One by one, she fed the secrets to the fire. She felt a profound sense of relief. By destroying the records, she was breaking the cycle. No one could sell these souls now. No one could use the math of the dead to build a new fortune. She was free. The Millers were just people again, broke and broken, but free. She imagined her life back in Chicago, the glass skyscrapers, the clean lines, the absence of shadows. She watched the last ledger turn to ash and felt a weight lift from her shoulders. But as the final page crumbled, the fire didn't go out. It turned a brilliant, sickly violet. Sarah stepped back, her heart skipping a beat. The ash didn't sit in the grate. It began to swirl, rising into the air in a rhythmic, controlled pattern. She realized too late. The ledgers weren't just records. They were the contract. A sharp, searing pain erupted in her palms. She looked down and screamed. The architectural coordinates she had etched into the stone were now appearing on her own skin, the flesh bubbling and scarring into the shape of the binding runes. The realization hit her with the force of a falling building. The seal required an anchor. It had been the laborers, then it had been Eleanor. By destroying the physical books, Sarah hadn't ended the debt. She had transferred the ledger to the only remaining Miller with the will to hold it. She wasn't free. She had just made herself the new book. The house around her groaned, but it wasn't a sound of threat. It was a sound of welcome. The doors clicked shut, not with supernatural violence, but with a quiet, domestic finality. Sarah walked out onto the porch of the caretaker's cottage, the small building that sat at the edge of the cemetery. Her Chicago apartment, her career, her future. They were gone, as distant as a dream. She sat in the single chair bolted to the porch floor. The morning sun was warm on her face, but she couldn't feel the heat. She could only feel the weight of the earth beneath her. She closed her eyes and listened. From deep below the soil, beneath the layers of red clay and reinforced concrete, came a sound. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It was rhythmic. It was patient. It was the sound of something counting the seconds until the next payment was due. Sarah leaned her head back and began to hum. It was a dissonant funeral dirge. The Miller hum. Her voice was steady, the melody acting as a physical barrier against the vibration in the floorboards. 1, 2, 3, she whispered into the morning air. The numbers were the only thing she had left, and she would have to keep counting forever.